All right, here. So good evening, everybody. We're here for our last keynote speaker Q&A for the GIFF conference, and I'm very happy to have Stacey Abbott here, who's a reader in film and television studies at Whedonverse University in the UK. And she's a very prolific scholar in television studies, especially in the fields of Gothic and horror. And so, yeah, we were just going to have a conversation again, as per usual. If you have questions, type it in the chat. We also have a bunch of things prepared. And yeah, we just want to talk about her work and go from there. So yeah, as I said, you are a very prolific scholar of television studies. And so I guess my first question is, how do you feel the field has evolved over the last, particularly like 10 to 15 years? So from a German perspective on all of this, it's still very hard to do popular culture studies at all at German universities. It's like people are doing it, but mostly early career scholars, I feel, still. And television is still like playing second fiddle to film as well. So do you feel like it's taken a lot more seriously in the UK? And yeah, maybe what has changed, as I said, over like the past maybe 10 to 15, 20 years?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say in the UK, television is taken seriously. There is an established tradition of television studies in the UK, although I would say historically it came more sociologically, so it was about the sociology of television. Who's watching it? How are they watching it? And then there was work around gender studies and soap operas. So there is a history of that. What I think has changed is, in a way, the move towards more textual studies of television, about treating television not just as something that we can talk about sociologically, but something that we can talk about as an art form in and of itself. I think that, for me, that's the thing that I've seen change over the last 10, 15 years, and particularly as I became more invested in television studies. It was, over 15 years ago, I'm dating myself, that the Trinity College had the American Quality Television Conference, which was a really big conference for me personally going to, and people were really excited talking about quality television and talking about TV that normally wouldn't be talked about as seriously, particularly genre television, from The Sopranos and Sex and the City through to Buffy and Angel, and I know we'll come on to that at some point. But so I think there has been a kind of gradual move towards treating television like an art form and as something we could talk about textually and take seriously. Having said that, there's always a caveat. I still think there are hierarchies, and there is definitely a generational difference. I think I come from a film department, so I think film has been receptive to TV studies. In my department, they're very receptive, but I think there is still perceived to be like film is more serious than TV, and you're still sometimes fighting those uphill battles about having your work taken seriously. And I know colleagues, I mean, to credit to Roehampton, I've always felt they value the work and they've taken TV very seriously. And I have colleagues at other institutions in the UK that maybe not have had the same experience, have had to fight a little harder to have their work taken seriously. So I still think there's a hierarchy, and I do think there's a generation. So I have been to conferences with senior scholars who will go unnamed, who were a little more sniffy about people who didn't come from TV, but were suddenly going, oh, well, you're all just a bunch of fans talking about this work that you're fans about, and sort of judging scholarship. So there's a generation. I think that, we see younger scholars. It's definitely I have a lot of students coming through wanting to do PhDs or MA work around television. So I think you definitely see this growing generationally. So I think we're seeing a shift.
Yeah, I feel like that's happening here too. I think it will be a question of how many of these early career scholars actually make it to a place where, they will kind of establish what's being studied. And I mean, that is kind of the breaking point we're at now, I feel.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, maybe more to television generally, since obviously, I mean, even in the past 5 years, so much has changed about how we consume television. I mean, once upon a time, all we had was network television, then cable changed everything already and also made it kind of, that's, I think, when academia kind of jumped in more and was like, oh, quality and what you just said. And then now, obviously, we're on to streaming. You can watch it anywhere you are all the time. And so do you think that has also affected genre, perhaps, since you study horror, gothic, the fantastic?
Yes. I do. I think the kind of that proliferation of spaces to find television, whether it's network, cable, digital, streaming, like there's so many places to find it, definitely works for genre, because if you're thinking about industrially, with all of these competing platforms, they're all competing for the same number of people. I mean, populations are expanding a bit, but you know, we're still, it's the same number of audiences. So they're looking for material that will draw audiences to their platforms. And genre works really well for that, because genre fans are loyal. And whether you're a fan of science fiction or horror or just the fantastic more broadly, I mean, I dabble in anything. I always say, like, you know, if it's too realistic, I'm not interested, but put a vampire in it or a spaceship, then I'm good. Like, you know, you're kind of, the fans of those types of genres are drawn to text and they will look. And so I think it's a very good time for genre, because I think the industry is recognizing that. And so that's why horror is everywhere, science fiction is everywhere. It's no longer ghettoized in the way that it used to be, particularly, well, science fiction was ghettoized as just for geeks, teen geeks. And horror was considered impossible to have on television. Like, it just seemed like a waste of time. And now they're everywhere, because fans will follow. But the flip side of this expansion, though, is there's so much content that it's also difficult to stay on top of things, right? You know, and I think we will look back to the 90s and early 2000s as this golden age where, you know, there was a lot, but you had a control over it. Like, you could really immerse yourself in all this material. Whereas now, like, I am constantly feeling behind on things. Like, oh, there's this there and there's that. And no, I haven't seen that. And none of us are watching the same thing because we're all watching it on different platforms. So there's also a little bit of loss of that community, because we're not all watching the same thing at the same time. So I think that's a give and take for genre. I think it's good, but I think we're still going to have to find our feet. And I think there's still the next few years. And I keep referring to the streaming wars. Like, I just think there's so many platforms, and how many services can we subscribe to? So, you know, it'll be interesting to see how that settles in the next couple of years, whether or not we'll start seeing a unifying of these platforms, you know, at some point. But now I do think it's a great time to be interested in genre. I think it's exciting. There's a lot to see. There's a lot to watch.
I think what you just touched upon in terms of like the industry suddenly legitimizing and recognizing it. I mean, I recall, I think, like, actors from Buffy, since we're going to talk about Buffy in a second anyway, saying, you know, they would never get nominated for anything, like the Emmys or the Golden Globes. And I feel like that, I mean, the awards, I feel like, are losing kind of the relevance they once had as well. But at that time, in the late 90s, early 2000s, they certainly had that kind of relevance. And they would constantly, like, even if they were once nominated for something like Hush or something, they would, I mean, if there was anything, everything would go to things like The West Wing. And I mean, The West Wing is a great show, but, you know, it's like political drama. It's not genre. Like, I mean, everything is a genre, but in terms of the speak, and it's genre means the fantastic and all of that. And yeah, it's true. And I mean, as you said, horror, like, because of the regulations of network television couldn't have worked, and then cable made that possible. And I mean, American Horror Story gets awards like nobody's business, right?
Absolutely.
And Game of Thrones, obviously, I think and I mean, capped, and then I mean, in terms of the community, Game of Thrones, I think, was one of the first ones that kind of had such a massive audience that everybody was actually watching it. And even the people that weren't watching it, they were getting the secondhand kind of social media onslaught, and then obviously the finale and all of that. But yeah, I think that the water cooler talk thing is certainly getting lost, and maybe.
Yeah, I think certain shows like Game of Thrones has that, because you're right, it's so big, everyone stops. And people who don't normally watch that type of genre television watch Game of Thrones. But you're right, I think it's the smaller shows, they are harder, people are watching them, but you're not watching it at the same time. You know, you might get around to it 6 months after someone else.
Yeah, I feel like some shows have, I think, tried to experiment with that more. So, like Star Trek Discovery releases weekly,
Yes.
in an effort, I think, to get the kind of water cooler thing back, so people actually watch it that time when it comes out, and instead of binging it over a weekend.
Yeah.
But maybe also connected to that, so like a lot of the things being produced are kind of steeped in a certain nostalgia. So I mean, Star Trek now gets more and more series, and the next one coming out, it looks like it will be very nostalgic. I certainly have opinions about that. But there's, but also, I mean, things like Stranger Things, who are blatant 80s nostalgia. And I mean, they're clever about it, but it feels like it's driving the genre specifically. So what do you think is kind of the future of that? Like nostalgia as a tool to tell stories or shape narratives and...
Yeah, nostalgia is a fascinating thing, and it's like I can't quite get my grip on it, because it romanticizes things, which is obviously part of the attraction, and it makes it like the Stranger Things is a great example of something that is tapping into a generational nostalgia. You know, dating myself, but I grew up in the 80s. I completely get all those references. I lived through that, but obviously it's a romantic version of the 80s, particularly politically, like, you know, this idea of looking back nostalgically to the 80s, which from a perspective of the 21st century and the kind of current world we're in at the moment, particularly in the United States, you know, it's nice to be all nostalgic, but the 80s was itself hugely problematic, like, you know, and so there's a possibility to use nostalgia to offer similar critique, to kind of compare these time periods and call attention to it. I'm not 100% sure these texts are necessarily doing that in the way that I think they could. I think there would be it'd be really interesting to see more work really using that nostalgia to critique it, to say, what are we being romantic about? What are we being nostalgic for exactly? As much as I love Stephen King and John Carpenter and all the things that Stranger Things is harking back to, it's also an idealized image of the past. The other thing I find fascinating, as someone who did grow up in the 80s, is, of course, that the sense of false nostalgia that this show generates for people who are generationally well beyond having grown up and were not even born anywhere near the 80s. And this sense of false nostalgia, where you're feeling nostalgia for something that you never experienced or not only didn't experience, but didn't exist. So I think there's a really interesting things going on there. I think industrially, obviously, it just taps into, obviously it taps into, you know, attracting audiences. You have certain audiences of a certain generation who will be drawn to that work, you know, who grew up with it, and also the filmmakers who are trying to relive their childhood. I think there's a real interesting way of drawing audiences to nostalgia. But I'm not convinced it's doing what it could critically, and there's no reason. It's commercial television. Why should it? You know. But for my taste, like, I would like to see something that was more critical of the 80s and use it in a way that I thought, well, actually, you're saying something quite interesting. Although I think it's doing, I mean, I love Stranger Things. Like, it's doing interesting things, but it's romantic. And I think we always have to be cautious about romantic.
Yeah, it's funny you said that thing about nostalgia for something we never experienced. Like, once upon a time, I wrote a master's thesis on teen film, and I titled it Nostalgia for the Things That Never Happened to Us, because it feels like the genre specifically taps into the idea that, you know, I mean, all the filmmakers make these films, these teen movies. Like, I mean, John Hughes in the 80s made these teen movies about his own, like, romanticized, or even not romanticized, because he clearly hated being a teenager, idea of being a teen as a grown-up, and that's always in there. And I mean, yeah, the kind of 80s nostalgia that Stranger Things has is certainly kind of cosmetic. Like, it's all about the look of it, and the music and the movies and all of that, but it's not they don't talk about Ronald Reagan or the AIDS crisis, you know.
Exactly. You know, I think, like, given the world we're in now, you could do something really interesting that really made those connections and said, look how far we've come or not come, or what, you know, we're repeating ourselves, or there are these, and it's not there. It's just not being done. And like I said, you know, as critics, we always have to bear in mind, from the point of view of television, that's clearly not what they want to do. Like, you know, and they're doing really well. So maybe that's not what audiences want. But in terms of a valuable text, you think, well, it's a missed opportunity. In the way that I think other texts do offer more interesting critique.
Yeah, I think it's the scholar brain. It never turns off when you watch television.
No, it doesn't. But if you look at something like Battlestar Galactica, when it was on, now obviously that was a remake, a reboot of a previous existence, so there was this element of nostalgia to that, lots of nice references back. It was a reboot, and anytime you're rebooting, there's an element of nostalgia. But that was one that was so self-consciously current and political in what they were trying to do with science fiction. You know, there's no subtlety. Again, it doesn't take an insightful critic to work out what they were saying at that point, at least particularly in the first couple of seasons, where it was so, the commentary on the war, the Iraq War and 9/11 was so obvious. And it was really interesting. So you can do it. But it's not always what they want to do, or what their audience wants them to do.
Well, I mean, at the same time, Star Trek has probably always been very political, and at the same time, there's like this massive fan base that goes like, but you know, it was just about space. It's like, well, you know,
it was never just about space. But you're right.
Final Frontier had nothing to do with real life or the Cold War ever.
No.
But yeah, I mean, that's also interesting in terms of how do people actually watch television, for what purpose. And I mean, certainly as a child, I didn't pick up on these things, so I get it. But I mean, and I think, that also kind of taps into the idea. So you edited a book series for IB Torres on cult TV. So I guess what makes a television show even cult or a classic anymore? Is that a thing still?
Well, it's a really good question. It's something I've been teaching a couple of classes on cult film and TV in the spring. So you spend a lot of time saying what just makes something cult, generally, let alone now. So I think one of the debates with cult is always, you know, cult is dictated purely by some arguments. It's dictated by audiences. You know, something is cult if an audience decides it's cult, like, and embraces it and celebrates it and identifies it. And the other thing for me, the key thing about cult is if it has longevity. If we're still talking about it in 10 years, 20 years, then you're going, well, and it still has that fandom. So it definitely has that, you know, that's the argument, saying cult is just something that audiences identify. So something like Firefly, Star Trek, you know, these are ones embraced by fans and made cult. But of course, the flip side is saying, well, what makes audiences identify? You know, so I'm still very attached to the textual argument, saying, well, there are themes involved in certain texts that will lend themselves to it. So I do think that a lot of cult texts, there isn't a tick box list of things, but I think things that are doing things that are innovative, new, people haven't seen, people grab on, people do respond, and particularly fans of particular genres, they get very attached to things that are transgressive or doing something new, whether they're consciously thinking about it that way, but that they really do say, no, this feels fresh, I haven't seen this before. But also, and something that's very immersive, that allows you to emotionally engage. So you look at the texts that have still long-standing cult fandoms, Star Trek, Buffy, Firefly, loads of texts. These are ones that are very well-rounded, immersive worlds that we all feel very, like, after many years of watching them, we feel that we understand that world. But they're also, they were pushing the boundaries of television. They were changing television, and people recognize that and are excited by that. So I think cult still has that. We attach ourselves as fans to these kinds of shows. where I think the landscape we're in now and where cult is interesting is that because, as we're saying before, there's so many providers, there's so many landscapes. Like, you know, does every network wants a show to be cult? They're trying to make shows because they want that committed audience. And if the networks or the providers or the platforms are trying to foster a cult show, then is it truly transgressive? Is it really the fans who are identifying it? So I think there are questions about that sense. If everything is cult, then does cult have any value? You know, if every show has that loyal following. So I think we're in interesting times where I keep questioning, you know, what is cult in this landscape? I think they're there, but I think we'll know in 10 years for sure. You know, I think there are texts that I would instinctively now say that we'll still be talking about, and fans will still be, I mean, we're still talking about the X-Files, we're still talking about Buffy. Orphan Black, I think we'll be talking about that. I mean, I think it will have a cult fandom. And it'll be maybe not, it was never a big audience, but it's a loyal audience. And my guess is that one really does speak to people who were very attached to that. I really loved Warrior Nun this summer, which I watched on Netflix. I don't know if we'll be talking that in 10 years. It was a great experience. Maybe we will, because it's too early to say. But I think it's about who, you know, what will we be talking about? And I think those are the kind of interesting questions.
Yeah, I found it really funny because after the reaction everybody had to the Game of Thrones finale, I regularly still see tweets or posts where people are like, nobody talks about it anymore because it was so bad. And then that tweet has like 11,000 retweets. And I'm like, do you realize you're currently talking about it? Like, even you're negatively talking, but you're definitely talking about it, and it seems to hold an interest.
Yeah.
So,
and people who desire that need to respond, you know.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I mean, I supervise, or not supervise, I had a student doing an essay on the British series Fleabag, which is, you know, often when we talk about cult, and I often talk about, you know, genre-based ones like science fiction, fantastical ones, but it was a really good essay about the cult of that series, and that, I'm sorry, I've just forgotten her name, but the creator of the show.
Yeah, Phoebe Waller-Bridge.
Thank you. My brain just lost her for a moment. But, you know, and I thought actually it's a very convincing case, and I think, you know, there are other types there are lots of texts that we may still be talking about that. I think we'll definitely still be talking about her. Like, I think she's going to be a cult figure in television. And that show might still always have that legacy of being that text that really, really, I mean, I know she's done loads of other things, and but I think more than Killing Eve, I think Fleabag is the show that has got that cult feel to it. And it's not fantasy, but it's transgressive, it's pushing boundaries and speaking to a very particular audience that are very committed.
Yeah, and I think we can come back to her as well, because I have a question later about gendering, especially in genre, but also because in terms of kind of the cult text, so I mean, Buffy, again, is one of the things you studied. You're one of the people that have studied. Obviously, Buffy is I think, still the most academically studied television show. Like, there is a thing such as Buffy studies. Again, your earrings fit this very nicely. But I feel like it's, like, people certainly still love it, certainly still talk about it, and at the same time, I feel like the discussion has also sort of shifted to read it much more critically, especially in terms of its creator.
Absolutely. I think the thing is, I've thought a lot about this, because Buffy studies, you know, and this is where, you know, being transparent for myself, you know, I'm a trained film scholar. I started off studying film, and it was Buffy that brought me into television. And Buffy was probably the first thing I ever wrote about television was on Buffy, and, you know, and that. So, which I came to through genre because I was interested with vampires. So I came to that. So Buffy's been a really interesting, I think it brought a lot of people to television who had never written about it and never took it seriously, not just within the films of popular culture, but within disciplines across, like, really interdisciplinary. And I think that's one of the things that's really fascinating about this wealth of Buffy studies, which is that there is a broad landscape of people coming from music, sciences, law, like people coming from across disciplines who don't normally associate with popular culture, recognizing the value of this text. So it has evolved from talking about this significant feminist text, and again, part of that landscape of taking television seriously, to say here, particularly cult television, particularly genre television, to say here you have this show with this ridiculous premise that is actually taken seriously. But I think you're right that the landscape has changed because television's changed. And we'll come on to Whedon in a moment, but the landscape of television has changed. So I still think Buffy is, I still think it holds up in many ways, but there are loads of ways it doesn't hold up, and there are loads of ways it never held up. Like even, at the time, and the most obvious thing being issues around race, where, it is the whitest of white shows. And I have a friend who's watching it now for the first time. It's been his lockdown project, has been watching Buffy, despite the fact we've been friends for 20 years and I've been talking about it for over 20 years. He's finally watching it. And he, his first comment was, I love it, but this is the whitest of white shows. The landscape of television now, at the time when it was being made, that was not as uncommon. That was pretty standard. But it began to be commented on. So Angel tries to address that a bit better, and it does it a bit better. I'm not saying great, but there is an attempt. But the landscape then was different. But you look at it now, and television, American television, again, by no means perfect, but it's a very different landscape where you expect a multicultural cast. You expect a cast that is dealing with identity in a very rich, complex way. Even a show is, I by no means think it's a great show, and it has its problems, but a show like Sabrina is a show that's very much part of its landscape. It's saying it's going to confront identity issues, which Buffy does not deal with very well. So that landscape has changed, and it's led to a lot of useful criticism. But what I really like about the work that's been done about it is that it's very intelligent work to recognize why this is a problem, and to use Buffy as a way of exploring how something can be good, but inherently problematic. And then we come to someone like Whedon himself, who I think is a complicated narrative. And I have to say, I do not follow all the details of some of the not scandals, but criticisms, but I'm broadly aware of major issues. And I think the thing with Whedon, and this is not going to come across as a defense, because if people behave badly or don't, there's no gray, But I think one of the reasons why attitudes have shifted towards him generally is, of course, he went from being a young, new face in television, offering something new and something which was in 1997 quite different and provocative and transgressive, to now he embodies the institution. He is not the young Turk coming in, the nice, exciting new filmmaker. He is institutional. He is middle class, older white man. And he is symptomatic of those issues of someone. And likewise, the criticisms about behavior on set are valid criticisms, and they're criticisms that he is embodying. I mean, again, it's not a defense, but there are criticisms that one could level against, I suspect, against loads of directors and producers in similar positions of power, and it's symptomatic of a problem in the industry. And because of his high profileness, it's coming out because he himself is more visible than other producers who are behind the scenes. So I think he's becoming a useful point to say, wait a minute, this isn't appropriate. This is not how you should work. We shouldn't accept this. So I think he's a really interesting, but I think we see that shift from being new, embodying the future of television, to someone who is now represents the institution. He is an older white man, and we're looking for change. We're looking for people who are going to do something different.
Yeah, and I think because at the time he was lauded as one of the good guys, or for the long, a feminist who was empowering women.
Yeah.
And at the same time, then you now hear the stories years later, and you're like, well, you know, it had, like, he had his limits. And then obviously, I mean, there's always the author question. I think when he kind of, he keeps being lauded as like the creator, the author of Buffy. And I mean, to a certain extent, he certainly is. But then there's all these people like Jane Espenson and all these women that really also wrote and created the show just as much as he did. They're just not associated with, like, if you know the industry, you know them, but like in the common knowledge of the thing, it's him.
Yeah, and I think going back to like different changing attitudes, both within Buffy studies, but also in television, is, you know, there's one of the ways that people legitimize television studies is by adopting the authorship argument, you know, is to find the single person who is this creative vision. And again, like he obviously, you know, whatever you think of Whedon, like I'm not going to completely disavow his creativity in creating that, you know, for sure. But it is a collaborative medium, like film. You know, there are multiple voices, and I think we always have to remember to look beyond that one person. And I think and I think there's been a shift, because I think people did leap on celebrating him because it was a way of legitimizing what we're doing. And now, for right or wrong, you know, I would prefer that people had shifted away from the authorship debate because they recognized it was flawed, than because they recognize that he is flawed. Because I think in a way that is a reality. He was always flawed. Like, he was always, you know, so many directors are flawed in similar ways. That is symptomatic. But I think the argument with in TV studies is to say, wait a minute, there's a problem with this framework. Let's look at all these people. When I was writing about Angel, you know, one of the things I did, and Angel was a useful case study because it was co-produced and co-showrun with David Greenwald. It immediately detached from that Whedon, that cult of Whedon, and say, well, yes, he's obviously important, but let's look at Greenwald, let's look at Tim Minear, let's look at loads of other people involved in that show, and say, look, this is a really creative group of people making the show. So I think there's that shift which is happening, for maybe not the best reasons, but it's happening.
Yeah. I mean, I just taught like intro to television, intro to film stuff, and I always start out by saying, like, look, I don't believe in the death of the author. Like, he's very much alive, but also there's multiple of them. Like, it's not him.
No.
And there's always a group, especially in a writer's room of a television show. And I mean, God Lord, sometimes creators even change throughout a show and they get passed on for various reasons. And you can't lose sight of that ever, because it's, you know, there's so many people always contributing to these things. But again, with Game of Thrones, all of the criticisms seem to be that they weren't following the lead of one man, namely George R.R. Martin, and that was their big failure in the end, or that's how it was framed. And that was also like very interesting case study in terms of like, who's the author of this? So yeah, and you were at some point between 2014 and 2016 the president of the Whedon Studies Association. So to make this less about him, since we just discussed him, but like, what is it like to be the president of an academic association like this, and specifically in this kind of field, which in that case is also very narrow, I guess. But yeah.
Well, it was interesting. It was all credit to that association. It was an amazing experience being part of that association, because the people, I mean, the association grew organically. It grew out of, you know, the Journal of Buffy Studies, and then it became the Journal of Whedon Studies because people recognized. And the adoption of Whedon became because suddenly you had Angel and Firefly and Dollhouse. So it grew organically. And I think one of the things that I found really rewarding about that experience was the fact that the people involved in it, I think, were part of the legitimizing of television studies, about recognizing an art form and saying and seeing those texts not as the only ones that could do it, but as a really good way of thinking about particularly television, although popular culture more broadly, as something that is textually valid, that is rich and nuanced, and they really fostered a great community. So I really enjoyed doing that. It was a huge organization with lots of different disciplines, and different approaches. So you don't always agree with what everyone's doing. And one of the tough things was getting the balance between being a scholarly association, which is what they were, or what the association is, it's still there, it is, but also the negotiating people's fandom. So one of the regular issues that I used to have was when people would talk about Joss, and I would go, well, do you know him? Like, you don't. And I think, and that was always an interesting debate about, well, you can be a fan, but we're also a scholarly association. So how do you get that balance? And that was a really interesting thing to do, and to work with people around that. It was also a great way to, particularly over the years of the association, to work with really good early career researchers, to see things in new ways and to think about it from a different generational perspective, and suddenly go, oh, I hadn't thought of. So the changing attitudes to a character like Xander Harris was fascinating. A character who, when he was on the air, was always, problematic and definitely, complex, but quite sympathetic. People, to gradually seeing, that kind of audience and critical reaction of saying, no, this is a highly problematic character, really toxic type of masculinity. And that was really good to kind of have people throw that out at you in ways that you go, okay, not everyone's saying that, but now you're looking at it through new eyes. So it was a really good experience of being involved with that, as much as it was a lot of work.
Always. Yeah, I think it's interesting. You just touched upon the idea of kind of like aka fandom, and we're in that space sometimes, because obviously if you engage with a text intensely, you most likely do so because you actually like and enjoy it. So you're probably a fan. I mean, there's certainly degrees of how much you then get involved actively in this fandom. Like, just because you like it, it doesn't mean that you go on Tumblr or write fan fiction, or, but at the same time, it's not uncommon for people to kind of move from fandom into academic scholarship of a text. And I feel like there's still a lot of criticism about that from parts of kind of academe. And like, I mean, I certainly had like book proposals and reviews getting back to me saying, well, they seem a bit, or the author seems a bit, editor seems a bit aka-fanish or whatever, and it's like, what are you trying to say then? Like, why is that a problem for you?
No, exactly. I find it interesting because I would argue that academia, particularly in the kind of humanities, is most people who do this work are fans. If you write about Shakespeare or Dickens or whomever, trying to think of like Mozart or something, whatever, the odds are you're writing about it and doing that research because you really like the work. But we don't think of scholars of literature, drama, music as being fans. And yeah, if you're talking about film or television, particularly popular culture, because again, I work with colleagues who write about French cinema and Godard and all this, and clearly they're fans. Clearly, they've spent their huge part of their career working in these areas, and quite rightly, like, great, they love the work. But no one would accuse them of that. So I think that is where those prejudices and hierarchies come. That when you're dealing with popular culture, of which fandom is quite visible, that you have to negotiate those. And obviously, I think as a scholar, I'm sure you feel the same way. When you're writing, you are trying to make sure that the fact that I love this text doesn't mean that I don't see the problems. I write about vampire films and TV. A lot of them are very bad. I can write about them and find something interesting, and I like the genre, but I can be critical and recognize the problems of them. And that's what I actually find really interesting is, in fact, who wants to write about a perfect text? Like, it's more interesting to write about something that's conflicted. So I think, I think we have to manage that. We're not there just to say, we're not there just to be a fan club, and to do fan, but I think it fuels what we do, because why would we do it? It's why, why spend all this time? you know, often our own time, like often off our own back.
Yeah, I very much agree. Because as you said, like it's so like in a way class based in terms of like how it's and gendered, because I mean a lot of fans are women and have driven fandoms from the very beginnings, and it's that kind of thing of like sneering about, you know, and then but again, like most of Shakespeare scholars are fanboys and girls, and
Absolutely.
they don't see themselves that way at all, because why would they? But it's exactly that problem, I think. And yeah, I mean, and at the same time, I mean, I've experienced both extremes, I think, of like particularly with Star Trek, when you read an article and it's like Gene Roddenberry's vision, and whenever I read the sentence Gene Roddenberry's vision, I want to murder somebody. But it's like or I mean, I wrote my monograph, my dissertation about Disneyland, and
Right.
I
Oh,
constantly get asked, do you like Disneyland? And I'm like, of course I like Disneyland, but that doesn't mean I can look at it. And in fact, like if I wouldn't like it, I would probably be a worse scholar of it, because I mean, it's a theme, like all the Disneyland theme parks around the world, I had to visit them for me. Like if I hadn't liked it, you know, I've read scholarship on Disneyland where it's blatant that the person doesn't like it, but already went in with that agenda.
yeah.
And that also informs their text. So it's not like that's better necessarily.
Exactly. Going in to be negative and, you know, slam something, you know, then that's not good scholarship. I mean, you know, we teach our students to be open, you know, go in with an open question and then, you know, work it out. So I think it is a problem. And you're right about the genderedness, that again, particularly in the realms, I mean, I'm sure that it comes in many realms, but in my experience going back to TV historically has been gendered, you know, in terms of scholarship. More women do TV studies. The, the fandoms, like teaching cult film and cult television is really interesting because, you know, again, cult television is very focused around female fandoms. Obviously you get female fans of cult cinema, but the scholarship is gendered. I mean, there's been really good work criticizing some of how the scholarship is itself sexist and how they've perpetuating certain attitudes to women. So there's a real interesting quality to that genderedness that I think we do have to struggle with and kind of fight that fight.
Yeah, definitely. We have somebody saying they had to drop out because their connection was getting iffy, probably because people were going home to watch television and
Yeah, exactly.
Very true, very true. Yeah, I want to shift gears a bit into more discussion of genre, because again, I mean, our conference was all about kind of speculative fiction. And so we had a question about how many, especially like science fiction shows, are kind of formulaic, at least in terms of the plot or the pitch that's behind it. So like, you know, you're on a ship, you're on a bridge, like whether it's all of Star Trek or the Orville or the Expanse, like it kind of goes back to that a lot. So maybe how do you think sci-fi shows can kind of break from that, or even also larger like genre tropes?
Yeah. Well, the problem with television, and this goes for film as well, the problem with these things is that it is a commercial industry. So when something does well, they will want to keep doing it. And Star Trek, particularly using that idea of the bridge of the ship kind of structure of science fiction, Star Trek had a very long legacy, and it's having this resurgence that means it's huge at the moment in terms of its influence. I was thinking when you mentioned that as a possible question, I'm sort of trying to think about science fiction shows that I think I've liked that break from it, and I think the ones I do think that break from it are the ones that it's oscillating between that formulaic genre of a certain trope, which Star Trek itself was just drawing upon westerns and submarine films, and you know, it's just recognizable genre tropes, to ones that science fiction series that tap into something that is a particular idea at the moment, or a particular recurrence or event or something that they're tapping into. And the two shows that leapt to mind that I really liked, that I thought were innovative, I mentioned Orphan Black earlier. And I was also a big fan of this Canadian series Continuum, which is a time travel police show. And both of them, I think, were responding to similar things in terms of technology, in terms of gender, well, Orphan Black in particular, dealing with changing conceptions of gender and identity. So really tying into something that is current thinking and thinking about the science in relation to that. You know, I think science fiction, to break from forms, has to find what is it you want to say, and then what's the best means to say it. Whereas science fiction shows like the Orville and Star Trek and The Expanse and other of those types, they're responding to a particular format of science fiction, which means it doesn't mean they can't do something, have something to say, or they can't do things innovatively. But what comes first is the form. Whereas I think shows like Continuum and Orphan Black are about an idea. And the other shows, like something like Black Mirror, which just throws out from episode to episode. Again, not that it doesn't have its flaws, but it is using that sense of science fiction as something that can comment on society. So for me, genre is about finding the new thing you want to say and what's the format. And it's the same with horror. Like, I love zombie. I'm a horror fan. I like zombies. I do like zombies. So, you know, you get the success of The Walking Dead, and then suddenly, you know, everywhere you turn, there's another zombie series, which, you know, I'm a fan. I'll watch a lot of them. But every once in a while, then someone does something where you go, well, actually, they have something to say. So I'm a big fan of the Korean series Kingdom, because that is a series where that is not just doing The Walking Dead, that is very embedded with their own history and culture. And it's about class politics, you know, which is very contemporary. You know, it's not just trying to say period, it's a very contemporary issue. So they find that thing, and then they reframe the genre to suit that. So I think that's what that genre needs to do. It always, good genre work will find that new thing they want to say, and then they find the new form way of doing it.
Yeah. I think for me, one of the most innovative things we've seen, and I wouldn't even know how to classify it properly, but DOA was like, I remember watching the first season of that and coming out of it thinking, I don't even know if that was good or complete nonsense. Like, I couldn't decide, and then basically I rewatched it, and then I watched the second season, and at that point I had arrived at the idea of that I think this is great, actually. And then obviously they canceled it, which is, you know, I mean, it also speaks towards what can you actually do in this market. And especially Netflix, that was kind of hailed as like, oh, you know, this is gonna revolutionize the way television is being made because it's streaming, so people pay for the streaming, so it's no longer advertiser driven or whatever, similar to cable, but even more of a democratic thing in a way. And then Netflix goes ahead and like gives them a 5-season deal but cuts them off after 2, and we're back to where we were back, you know, in the 90s.
Yeah, I find the Netflix model really interesting to watch it as it unfolds, because you're right, everyone sort of sees this as this kind of savior of television, but I kind of, you know, consistently we're now seeing, with few exceptions, shows being canceled after like 2 or 3 seasons because they kind of got out of the show what they wanted. They got enough new subscribers, and then they go, yeah, we're done. Which in some respects is worse than network television, which would cancel shows because they couldn't get enough figures. Like somehow, because this promises so much more, and yet it's not. Whereas a network television, like, I'm a huge fan of Hannibal. I think it was amazing we got 3 seasons out of NBC with Hannibal. I would obviously want more, but we got 3 seasons out of network television of that show, which I never would have thought you could do on network. And so you're just going to go, yay, got it. Whereas Netflix, I think we for too long thought this is going to be the answer to our problems, and it's not. It just creates new disappointments.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I still kind of hope that the cancellation of the ER is actually like a hoax. Like, part of me, because if you've watched the show and how it ends up in season 2, and I mean, Jason Isaacs likes to lie to people anyway.
Yeah, exactly.
But you know, but so yeah, in terms of genre again, so you edited a special issue of a journal on the X-Files, and I think that's always been very interesting in terms of what genre is it even. Like, I mean, there's mystery, and that has kind of a thing to it, but I think mystery, the whole mystery genre seems to consist of Twin Peaks and the X-Files.
Yeah.
So yeah, how did you deal with that, perhaps also in scholarship of the show? Like, was there any questions of...
Yeah, I mean, that particular issue we did was in the Journal of Science Fiction, Film and Television.
Right.
But one of the things I liked about that particular journal is they are quite receptive to fluid definitions of genre, which is really nice, because I think particularly with television, I mean, you might disagree, but I think genre is something that is always to a degree hybrid in film, and there's always multiple things, but television itself is something that is always has an element of hybridity, because if it's multiple episodes, I always say this, particularly with horror, you can't sustain horror, that emotion of horror, consistently for 22 episodes or even 10 episodes. Like, you have to go in peaks and troughs, which means you need a bit of drama and you need a bit of comedy. The X-Files, I think, for me, it's all kinds of genres. I think mystery for sure, and it's definitely in that tradition of Twin Peaks of being, we're not quite sure what this show is. But I think where it worked really best was in that hybridity of science fiction and horror, where you're constantly not quite sure what's happening, and it is oscillating between, the truth, the conspiracy, alien narrative, and just that sense of the world being a really unsettling place because it isn't what we think it is. And that it brought together the best of science fiction and horror. But it makes it hard, when you write about it, I think sometimes you just have to decide, well, look, it's many things, but I'm going to talk about it in relation to this. Because, you can't talk about, because some of my favorite episodes of The X-Files are comedy episodes, which it does brilliantly, or it did brilliantly. And then how do you negotiate that? Is that satire, or is it sometimes they are just playing out comedy? So I think it's what makes a show really interesting is if it's not easy to categorize, then I think actually there's more I want to talk about there, or I want to unpack, because if it's easy to categorize, like I love Star Trek. I grew up watching Star Trek. I haven't written about Star Trek very much, because for me, I don't, like you said, it's always been political. It wears its meaning on its sleeve, and I'm not remotely putting down scholarships and down the X-Files. I'm not Star Trek. There's loads of good things. I'm sure there's a lot to say. It doesn't speak to me to want to write about it, because I like that complexity. I like that messiness of the X-Files, and messiness can be fun to work with, because you think, well, it's not perfect, or it's not trying to be clear-cut one thing.
I'm definitely glad you didn't do as much on Star Trek, because then I couldn't be editing the Routledge Handbook to Star Trek right now, probably.
But that's great, and I think there's really important stuff out there to say about Star Trek. It just, for me, it doesn't, I love watching it, and I will read your book, and I will read it.
Read the one I just did at Discovery. I think that's the better one. But actually, and that ties in with my next question. So you have at least written one article that I found specifically to do with female creators of speculative fiction, because as we all know, like, the industry is still massively sexist, but specifically when it comes to these kinds of genres that are considered male dominated, and especially science fiction certainly has, horror as well. And we had, like, one of the first Q&As we did for this conference was obviously with Mary Chieffo, who's was an actress on Star Trek Discovery, and has also directed and exists as a woman in this industry. So we also kind of talked about that from her perspective. So I thought it would be interesting in terms of kind of like an academic perspective on that.
Well, yeah, no, I think it's really interesting. I mean, when I wrote that article, which was about kind of female creators, it was, in a way, it was going back to the point we're making earlier, which is that, there's been so much focus on, when talking about authorship, about the showrunner in television, the single voice. And then so when people look to find the female voice in these areas, they'll often not see it, because the majority and particularly historically, the majority of showrunners or executive producers would be men. You know, it's a hierarchy within television. So what I kept saying, but you know, that is a limiting perspective to say that there are no women out there. There definitely aren't enough. It's definitely, you know, the numbers, as if you read in the article, the numbers are really low. But when you start looking, at least if you start looking beyond the senior executive producers to the writers, to the directors, and you can go further to the music, to the costuming, makeup. There's so many contributors to these texts that are women. There's a lot of women working in this industry. So I was really interested in sort of saying, well, look, wait a minute, where are these voices? Like, where are they coming in to say, actually, they're all important contributors? You mentioned Jane Espenson earlier, like such an important voice within speculative television, both science fiction, horror, fantasy. You know, she's a really key voice and has benefited, is established enough for her career to be more recognizable and known as a creator than some other women who, and Marty Noxon's another one who now has done really well, and they've worked their way. But anyone who knows anything about the industry knows that it takes longer for women to work their way up through the industry to get those jobs. There's hierarchies in place that have been severely criticized for saying, you know, that to direct episodes of television, you know, often they have these set lists of directors who they draw from, and they become this kind of go-to list, and to even get on that list is really challenging. Fortunately, it's changing slowly. So a TV series like Jessica Jones, made with a female showrunner, and with really made an effort to say, no, actually they were going to have, I think season 2 had entirely all women directors coming in to direct that, and it was conscious choices. So we're starting to see that recognition. The problems get even more like difficult once you start talking about people of color and women of color, because all the women I've named are white women working within the industry, and it's even harder. So it's the women. I think what we need to do to start identifying those voices, we need to look beyond the senior roles, start identifying all the work, that craft work that's going on, that are really important to the industry. And then you start recognizing that space, that we need to be looking at who these women are, who are actually the backbone of television. So we watch, The Walking Dead. Walking Dead, people talk about Greg Nicotero, Scott Gimble, but the current showrunner now is a woman, Angela Kang. Gail Ann Hurd is the producer, and we need to be talking more about them and not just always going back to Greg Nicotero, because Greg Nicotero is this kind of geeky horror fan kind of cult figure, which often people will talk about. You know, we need to be going, well, look, actually, this is a show with actually a lot of women writers, a lot of women involved. I haven't looked at directors on that show, but I think there are. Actually, I don't know. I hope there are a lot of women directors, but I actually haven't looked. But I know there are a lot of women writers for that show, and we need to be looking for that as scholars to say, look, let's not just write about the same people. Yeah. And then hopefully that will, and that all feeds into the landscape of the industry that is also trying to change, and it's a slow uphill battle. But if we start looking at those figures and start saying, look, let's talk about these women, let's look at the contribution is being made by women, then it's fuel to the desire for change, to say, and what can we do if we had more and we saw more like that in better, more seats of power.
Yeah, very true. I mean, I keep coming back to Star Trek just because I just did so much work on it, or keep doing work on it right now. But I mean, there's also, I think, in that franchise, you can kind of see a more like an actual effort on getting more people of color, but also and Black people and women generally, like not just in front of the camera, but also behind the scenes. So I mean, absolutely. Star Trek was famously massively white male dominated all through basically the early 2000s. So it's like starts with Gene Roddenberry, who again is constantly hailed as this visionary. And then it's Rick Berman, who isn't even claiming to be a visionary, but he's like your run-of-the-mill exec, and you know, has a horrible history of being homophobic and sexist, and kind of, you know, is in a key position for decades of this franchise. And then, you know, with Discovery, they start over, and I mean, it's far from perfect, like even in terms of their representation and anything, but just like in terms of the numbers of Black people, people of color, women that also direct the show and write the show. So like Bowie Kim is a Korean woman who writes for it and is supposed to also co-write, create the Section 31 spin-off with Michelle Yeoh. And I mean, that would be a thing, you know, like an Asian woman in a main character role written by another Asian woman.
I know.
Like, I mean, that would be a big deal for the American television industry in 2020. And all of these things. There's also a bunch of directors. Also, I think Picard, the first episode of Picard was directed by a Black woman.
Yeah.
Hanelle Culpepper, I think. And they, you know, they're making that effort, or even the costume design on Discovery is a Black woman.
Yeah.
So you can see that they're trying to make that shift. That doesn't always mean everything changes radically, but at the same time, you know, and they're also currently, Discovery has now, they've changed showrunners a bunch of times, but they ended up on a woman, so at least. And yeah, and you specifically also said like the gendering, and that we have to talk about this in scholarship. And do you feel that there's a same kind of gendering? I think we touched upon that, but like in academic scholarship, in terms of like who gets to write on what, and that there's genres that is still understudied. So you did a collection a while back on romantic comedy.
I know.
And that's famously a female genre.
It is, for sure. I mean, I think we do still see gendering within scholarship. In terms of who does it. I mean, I think it's shifting and changing. Like science fiction is a really good one, which I think historically was always seen as this very masculine genre, you know, and horror. Horror is actually, horror is probably a little more interesting because horror really was seen as this very masculine genre. And, you know, if you look at, you know, if I look at my bookcases of scholarship on horror, you know, it's mostly, you know, historically it's mostly male writers with some key women, you know. So obviously we have our Barbara Creeds and our Carol Clovers, and there, you know, there are some key important women. But, you know, I think that is shifting. And I think, you know, now I go to conferences about horror and it is 50-50, if not more women who are writing about this. And I think that we're seeing that shift in scholarship where we're not seeing, again, generationally, we're not seeing people thinking that this is something that women can't write. I still think sometimes the kinds of things, like there's still sometimes gendering around the types of genres. So obviously I write about vampires. Okay, it's okay for women to write about vampires because, you know, that's a girl horror genre. Whereas, you know, it's less common or a little more transgressive to be writing about, you know, really hardcore, violent genre films. So, you know, you do sometimes still find that, not that women aren't doing it, but, you know, there are categories where it's less common, but I think that's changing. And I think the television thing is really interesting, that television, you know, is still very gendered. And I think it's working, it's good. I mean, it's exciting because what we're seeing is lots of exciting women coming in talking about all kinds of television, whether it's Janet McCabe and Kim Akast talking about Sex and the City and The Sopranos, or, you know, other women talking about, you know, Lorna Jowett talking about Battlestar Galactica. You know, there's a lot of women talking about television in exciting ways and leading the way on television studies. So it does mean, like I said, you still sometimes have those upper, and I think that's where the whole argument about fandom becomes gendered. You know, suddenly you're being kind of put in your place by these more senior male scholars. But, you know, I think we're gradually moving out of that, gradually. It's a slow battle. It's a slow battle within academia. We're all still fighting it. You know, it's still skewed away from us. And again, even worse when we start thinking about race.
Yeah.
It's even more complicated. Like,
Yeah,
it's,
I mean, also disclaimer, I mean, we keep talking as if there are only two genders, which is of course also not true, but that's the way
absolutely,
the industry still perceives all of this as well. It
absolutely.
kind of reflects on how scholarship perceives of it and all of that. Although I have to say, I feel like I also always have hope about these things when I look at my students, because I mean, as I said, I taught film and television, and I taught kind of a structured it according to genre, because most of my students in Augsburg would come from a literary studies background, so I felt like that was the easiest way to get into it for them. And then, but interestingly, like, they took me by surprise when they could freely pick their term paper topics, and there was a host of women every time, like in two semesters in different classes on different levels, lots of women writing on horror, like on like, you know, Hannibal and all of these things. And I had two or three men that wanted to write on rom-coms, and you're like, well, you know, like maybe they're like, it's just not that way anymore. I mean, I had trouble finding anybody that wanted to do a presentation on action film. Like, no men wanted to present an action film. I know women for that, obviously, nobody else either, but then they, like, you know, they were much more interested in talking about drama and rom-com and all of that. And it was really interesting to me. And I mean, obviously I have a wonderful, like, I usually at least always had one student that openly identified as non-binary in these classes. And, you know, it's great, I think, to see the shift maybe also in how they perceive all of this, and
Absolutely.
they might go on to do scholarship.
Absolutely. And you're absolutely right. It's so easy to fall into that trap of not thinking that way. And you're right, because I've had some really outstanding work, particularly because a lot of my teaching is genre-based. I teach, you know, very, you know, both undergraduate and MA. And, you know, there's something about working within these genres. Like, I've seen some really exciting scholarship from trans or non-binary students, really, you know, exploring how these genres and rereading films or TV series in a very different way than I've seen them, because they're looking at them through that lens. So I had a great paper on Let the Right One in relation to non-binary, which I've always, you know, it's a film I've always thought about in terms of it being trans and, you know, transgressing gender binaries. But this was a really great paper about thinking about as non-binary and the vampire. And, you know, so we are getting this new generation is opening up our eyes in really good ways about not being so restricted, but is hopeful. And I hope for my students who are all, you know, filmmaking students, that, you know, that will lend themselves, you know, they are going to be making what we're watching in years to come. So we hope that the industry is trying to change. You know, it's, you know, there are people pushing it in the right direction.
Yeah, we'll hope that, especially as the pandemic doesn't throw it back, because obviously now when people are saving money, the first things to go is the innovative projects where they don't know if they can recoup the money.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, actually on to my last question here, and obviously maybe there still be something from the audience here, but so you have your upcoming book project is on global TV horror. So I was just wondering if you want to talk a bit more specifically to that, or horror studies in general, because I feel like there seems to be a wave of horror studies happening.
Well, I keep saying we're living in apocalyptic times, which I said long before the pandemic, and now suddenly it's like, oh my God, we really are.
Be careful what you wish for, yeah.
Exactly. But I think horror is going through a very good period. Horror never goes away, but it's definitely going through a phase of being recognized as being something that is valuable. And so it's both doing well commercially and it's doing well critically, because people are for whatever reason, for right or wrong, they are kind of recognizing the value. Sometimes I say for wrong, because sometimes they're acting like it hasn't always been good. And I would say, well, actually, there's a long history of great films that have been doing really interesting things. So it is a really exciting time for horror, because I think people are just recognizing the potential. And because we're living in difficult times, horror films and television thrive in complex times because that's what they're about. So they respond to it. So recently there's a British film made called Host, which is available on the streaming service Shudder, which has got a lot of attention because it was shot in London during lockdown. So it's all shot on Zoom, all done, in camera, on Zoom. And it's a very effective response to what's going on. It's not political, it's not comedy, but it's capturing a moment, and we'll all look back on this film and go, yes, I remember like that uncanniness of this. It really does, it's good. So I think that's exciting. The global TV horror book is nice. It's been nice to do that because, and it should credit, I'm co-editing it with my collaborator, Lorna Jowett. And really the idea came from having written a lot about horror and this kind of boom of horror in television, that while both of our research focused mostly on English language TV, British, American, Canadian, we started seeing actually we're getting access to see that actually this is booming not just in those countries but around the world, that actually there is growing material out there. And we thought, the time is right now to start saying we need to be talking outside and thinking about that global attraction. So it's a really exciting collection with, we've got people talking about Iranian horror, TV, Brazilian, Spanish. I always forget everything that's in it. But it's been really interesting, and people talking about the kind of from the very local perspective of local folklore and how that's been covered on television. It's a really great piece about Brazilian folklore and that tradition in television. To people also talking about global phenomena. So we do have a piece on the global reception of The Walking Dead and how that's traveled around the world and how it's been marketed and changed television in terms of broadcast. But then stuff on Netflix and the way in which Netflix is fascinating at the moment. For all we quite rightly criticized it, it's also giving access to material that we might not be able to see before. It's not that all this stuff wasn't there before, but we just didn't have access to it unless you were really good at that kind of file sharing fan culture, which I'm really bad at. I have to say I'm really bad at kind of getting that kind of clandestine access. So I love the fact that I can turn Netflix on and watch horror TV series coming from India and Korea and Germany and the Netherlands, and and you were seeing really exciting material. So the book is trying to kind of unpack a lot of those ideas to say, well, what does horror mean when we start looking beyond what is most familiar, which is the kind of English language material. So there's a bit on English language, but mostly it's trying to think of that global perspective and why is horror so, and still raise questions. So the last chapter is actually a dialogue between various scholars sort of talking about saying, is this the great promise that we're saying, or what are the problems? Because we sort of talk about Netflix and the benefits of Netflix, but what are the problems of that model as well? So it's kind of nice to unpack, is this the new golden age that we think it is, or what are the pitfalls now? So it's interesting. We'll see. Comes out next year. She says, plugging.
Yeah, you're welcome to plug this. Like, people will probably buy or at least get it from the library. So,
Yeah.
I very much agree. Obviously, the access to things has gotten better, at least for like international stuff, and you no longer have to like buy region coded DVDs from somewhere or do file sharing and all of these things. I used to do, like, I don't know, 15 years ago.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, I think that's really broadened the field. And I feel like our academic work on it broadens. Like, obviously we're always trained in certain disciplines. My background is in American studies, so most of my stuff will still focus on the American market, because obviously I understand the culture it comes from better, but at the same time, I started to do some things on British television or German, or, and I have a friend who started to just, work on K-drama because she loves it. And she isn't trained in Korean studies, she's a musicologist, so she mostly thinks about the music in it, but, it's a thing. And I think that's definitely helped a lot. And it's gotten much easier to teach television now that I can just dream it in class. And
absolutely.
Have to, like, find DVDs and
it's amazing. There's so much good about doing television now. Like, it is very exciting, and it is great to teach. You're right, absolutely. So good.
Much easier, especially now with online teaching. I could just start, do you all have Netflix or something?
Yeah.
That was definitely helpful this semester.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I guess I'll just give one more chance to get questions from our audience. And if there aren't any, we can definitely just wrap this up a few minutes early. But like, let's give them 2 or 3 minutes to think. So if you have anything more that you want to talk about, you just plugged your book. Do you have other things you want to plug?
So I'll just shamelessly promote something.
Yes, promotion is allowed. I did that too. I even managed to plug almost everything I'm currently doing.
No, my only blatant self-promotion is that my next book comes out in October in time for Halloween, which is a book on the Catherine Bigelow's Near Dark, which is one of the BFI Classic series, which I'd say was a real delight to write. Because I tend to write works on, like, books on multiple texts. Yeah. So, you're writing on TV horror, and you're watching loads of television or loads of films, which I love doing because I love that thinking across all these different series. But and I always try to do a certain element of close analysis, but you're always getting that balance. So to be able to spend 26,000 words on one film is a luxury. Highly recommend it if you ever get the opportunity to write something on one film, because it was so rich. Like, you just went, no, I'm going like frame by frame. It's a real delight. And I hope people get that when they read it. Like, I heard it because I love the film, and it was great to write something like that. But yeah, that's where I've been finishing off in the global TV horror.
Yeah, maybe then a practical follow-up question, like, how do you end up writing for the BFI Classic film series? And for those of you that don't know, I mean, there's a television one as well, but I think the film series is much more well-known, and you have like academic treatments, as you just said, of films. But like, how do you end up doing that? Do they ask you, or do you just pitch to them?
I think historically, I think the series can go either way. Like, I think they do approach people. I pitch to them, and what I did, and a few people have asked me this recently, so I think they're probably going to get a lot of messages from people following me.
During lockdown, people are like, hey.
No. But what I did was, because I've always wanted to write for the series. Like, I love the series. And I've always had in the back of my head that I would think Near Dark would work really well. I was always a bit cynical that they may not go for it. So what I did was I emailed the publishers and just said, would you be interested in a proposal on, and at that point I actually suggested Near Dark or Let the Right One In. Because I thought they would go for Let the Right One In, to be honest. I did think I was very cynical and thought they would go for the Swedish art film. But I just sort of say, because it's kind of a specific series, I didn't want to write a proposal to find out actually they were never going to consider it. Like, as far, because
somebody's already doing it. I mean, you don't know what they have in the
pipeline. Someone else could be doing it. They could actually go, you know what? Absolutely not. Because I do know people who've approached them about certain titles and have been said no, because either they don't know if it's a classic yet, they're decided, or they just don't feel it quite fits the series. So I just emailed them and said, would they be interested in the proposal? And then they did come back and say yes. And I said, and say yes, so they would welcome a proposal. So then I put in a proposal. And then then my warning to anyone who does it does go to multiple boards, because BFI sees it. It's published through Bloomsbury, but also you have a BFI board. So it's a lengthy process to actually get to the contract, like to actually get them to finally say yes. But I think they can approach people. I think they do approach some cases. I know of people who've been approached to write it. Because the way the BFI series does, some of their books have come out to tie into events or particular things that they are doing. So they did the Gothic season. They wanted books at that point to come out that were connected to that. So I think in those cases they approach people. But they do accept people to pitch something. And you just have to accept the fact that you may or may not get them to agree.
Yeah, yes. I mean, that's the publishing process. I mean, now I snuck in a publishing question, tying in with our last workshop, which was all about academic publishing. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, again, it goes to show, like, just sometimes just ask people, like, and then, it's not rocket science. It's really—
No, exactly, because they're usually up pretty quick to say, yes, no, we're
Okay.
not.
And
'Cause
then,
yeah, because I just think there's no point in spending a lot of time on something, particularly if it's for a series. That means, you know, it's not something you can easily transfer to someone else. You know, then you think, well, don't do the proposal unless you have, you know, they're at least going to be receptive. It's not a guarantee, but at least you know they're receptive to the idea.
Yep.
Because I just think we have enough demand on our time. So, you know.
Definitely.
You
Yeah.
know.
All right. So there don't seem to be any questions. We have a comment. Thank you for this wonderful, insightful Q&A. Enjoyed it very much. So yeah, I want to thank you again for being here, and I hope that at some point we actually meet in person at a
really nice.
have those things again. I miss going to conferences.
I miss going to conferences. I do really miss going to conferences. But these things, at least being able to do things like this is very helpful. But meeting people actually face to face would be nice.
Fingers crossed one day. All right. So I'll stop the recording.
Yes.